alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a guest serendipitously close to one of our recent guests on the podcast, Shane Wilson. Welcome back. Well, welcome to the show for the first time, I should say. Gosh.
Well, I mean, if Brian was here recently, then it was basically like I've been here, at least in spirit, right?
Yeah. Brian Tan,
so thank
co-host.
you. It is nice. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, welcome back for the very first time, Shane Wilson. So, Shane, what sort of stuff do you write, and what else do you do?
Always a good question. It's the question that we all get right at the beginning of these things, and I think that we should all have a practiced answer, but I don't know that I do yet. So I write contemporary fantasy novels. I write music. I do some podcasting myself over at the Plotaholics with Mr. Brian Tan. I've also written a stage play adaptation of a short story that I wrote a while ago, and I've also just recently gotten a byline on some libretto for opera. So it's just a full gambit here. But I think that if you want to sort of get at the heart of what I write, it's probably just kind of lyrical narrative of a variety of types.
Oh, that's cool. A variety of lyrical narratives. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. How would you define lyrical as far as it goes? Like sonorous, whatever. I'm just trying to think what does that really mean for you?
Yeah, I think for me it kind of goes back to my roots. The first real serious writing that I ever did was poetry. And so I do have roots in that style, and I would say that poetic language is very lyrical and that it's rhythmic and that it at least tries to achieve some level of sublime language, right? Like an elevated sort of diction. And something that I really like to play with in all of my work is this blending. I don't even like the word blend, but finding places where sublime language bumps up against vulgar language, sort of like the sacred and the profane kind of approach, right? I like playing with that juxtaposition of language. I think it can be really powerful sometimes.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my favorite characters from the Hyperion books by Dan Simmons, who was a poet. He was one of the main characters, this poet, who at one point in his like backstory, because it's basically the Canterbury Tales in space is like the byline for the first book. So all these different characters are telling their stories of how they got on this journey, where they were all talking to each other basically. And the poet is the guy. He's this ancient, wizened poet who's been around since forever because it's for science fiction, so space travel and stuff, and has had a really prolonged life. But at one point in his backstory, he lost all his ability to speak except he basically got brain damage from cryostasis or something, and he couldn't the only words he would remember were basically curse words. He's like, and eventually he recovers from this, of course, but it's like he all he could say for like years on he's just trapped on this mining planet, and he had to communicate surely with like fuck,
right?
that kind of thing. So that's pretty similar to. I mean, that's what that reminded me of when I said not necessarily similar, but yeah, that kind of combination, or like Howl by Allen Ginsberg, one of my favorite poems.
Absolutely is I think a very good example. A lot of the beat poets kind of do that, right?
Yeah.
That towing the line, because the poetic language has, like I said, kind of this elevated diction that just kind of comes along with it. And then when you introduce these more rugged subjects, or even like to dip into like your figurative language, where your metaphors aren't all like doves and clouds and flowers and stuff, right? Instead, sometimes it's a broken beer bottle on the side of the highway, right? Like I think there's a beauty to mine out of just about anything in human experience. And I think that the job of the writer in a lot of ways is to look for the beauty and the sadness in all of those things.
Yeah, no, that makes I couldn't agree more. That is, and it's powerful when you've got this I mean, these grim or dark or gritty elements. If you're always focused on some, it's one of those. I mean, I guess it goes back to a lot of the stuff they talked about on writing excuses back in the day. That podcast, for a pretty reasonable podcast, very successful. But one of the things they would always say on that show is like, or I think it's Brandon Sanderson would always say on the show is that, if you're at a 10 all the time, you might as well be a 0. But also you can change what you're showing. So it's not just a volume control. Writing is not just like intense versus not intense. There's also, beauty or like obvious beauty versus surprisingly powerful imagery that's not necessarily fun to look at or whatever. I mean, it's not the metaphors that make you say, well, that sounds pleasant.
Right. I mean, I always think about this long 18th century work called Rasselas. And are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
There's this character in this book called Imlac who is talking about what the job of the poet is supposed to be. And I always sort of like use that as a touchstone that Imlac says that he's supposed to be the legislator of all mankind, right? Like that he doesn't necessarily write the laws, but he articulates the laws of human nature and explores what it means to be a human. And he lends voice to those things that are voiceless, those feelings that we have and the abstractions of life, right? And I think that is really what we all are trying to do if we work in the arts at all, is we're trying to find a way to ground the more intangible aspects of our reality in some kind of art, right? Be it visual art in a painting or sculpture or in a book or whatever. Like there's a power in words and in paint and in music to capture these things that we just don't have in other ways.
Yeah, definitely. And the artifice, the creation, it has its own traits because it's all, and that's why you can have things like stories within stories or stories that refer to other stories, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it makes so much sense. Those other stories being now context and objects within the front story or whatever. I don't know. I'm just thinking abstractly and now. It's not very useful necessarily.
I'm fascinated with framing devices like that too. When you start talking about how narratives are framed up, so the Canterbury Tales you mentioned, right, is sort of the classic example of story within story, and there's a really rich tradition in American literature. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. All of these stories are just Rip Van Winkle, right? Like all of these are sort of framed as nonfiction stories, even though they're fiction, right? They're framed as, we found this guy's journal up on this mountain, like let's read about it, right?
Yeah, and the Lord of the Rings too. Lord of the Rings as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think that's just such an interesting concept. I sort of played with that in my first novel, where my first novel, A Year Since the Rain, is about the collapse of this town due to drought. And it gets so dry there that the ground actually dries up and crumbles in on itself, and the town sort of disappears into the dirt. And the whole novel is sort of this long letter that one of the citizens of this town is writing to an ex-lover who left town. And the beginning of the novel starts with this note from a archivist at a university in a nearby city that sort of contextualizes that this is the letter of one of the citizens of what used to be Wasser, right? And so it's just kind of does that same, like, we found this on the side of the road and now we present it to you on a bridge. You draw your own judgments from it.
Oh, that's cool. It's also got kind of a magical realism kind of vibe there with the dirt. It gets so dry the town just disintegrates basically.
I use the phrase contemporary fantasy because
okay, sure.
I think it's like buzzier, but I think it's probably closer to the magical realism tradition. That's definitely what I studied more in college. I wrote my master's thesis on Salman Rushdie. So like I am well versed in at least the Indian tradition of magical realism, less so in the Latin American tradition. But I mean, I've read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but I read a lot of Rushdie and some Arundhati Roy. And so I think that when you consume that stuff, it just kind of gets into you, like whatever it is, right? Like whatever
Yeah.
your genre is. But that's what I was reading a lot of. And so when I started to write, that's what came out, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I started writing when I was quite young. I had mostly read science fiction and fantasy up to that point. Still, and that's basically still what I write. So yeah, I started writing as a young teenager. But then when I was an English major in college, what I wrote changed. I mean, the fiction I was writing at the time was way different than the fiction I'd write afterward. That by a long shot. Yeah.
Well, and what you read in college is unless unless you just love literary fiction, it is the only 4 years to 6 to 8 years of your life that you will read literary fiction or the classic canon, right? Like ever. It's valuable, all of that stuff. I think that the canon is definitely worth revisiting and redefining, and maybe opening up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But I think that stuff is really important for writers to experience, even if it's only for a little while, because like what we do is steeped in such a rich tradition.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to kind of understand where that stuff comes from, you know?
No, absolutely. I mean, and it goes back to, even in the genre of fiction, even in, science fiction and fantasy, my favorite genres, there's early stuff. I mean, I read stuff in my English major that was related to that. It was like Frankenstein, and there's a number of like the Blazing World, the first self-insert science fiction story maybe ever.
Yeah, I mean, a ton of the like the Victorians were some of the pioneers of sci-fi, right? You mentioned Frankenstein, but like H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
And like there's so much cool stuff in the Victorians because they were all like basically terrified of science.
It's true. Wells was very afraid. I mean, War of the Worlds, and he had books about air wars, I believe, like with balloons and stuff, just bombing cities off the map. I think that was Wells.
Yeah. That I'm not sure.
Those ones weren't as classic. They didn't survive as well.
Yeah. They were all just kind of afraid of what was coming, right? Like that. Mm-hmm. And so this whole science fiction genre was kind of born out of, and some of it's even can even double as horror, right? When you start thinking of Jekyll and Hyde and things like that, and Frankenstein. But these are just all examples of what happens when a scientist like goes crazy, right? Or
it goes too far.
Yeah. Like, do we really want these people playing God? I mean, that's kind of the question at the center of a lot of that classic sci-fi. And I think fantasy has an even richer tradition. I mean, you can go all the way back to Arthurian legend and Beowulf and all of those, and Gilgamesh even, right?
Yeah, and actually, to go back to the frame stories, you could go back to, I guess these were mostly, 1001 Arabian Nights. That's a good one. Mm-hmm. That came out in English. It was much newer, of course, but right. But those stories and the frame story around them, and there's this king and caliph, and he's very, very suspicious of his wives. Oh, okay, this guy, okay,
yeah.
And that frame story alone kind of makes those stories for me. It's like, okay, that's great. And maybe someday I'll be able to read them all. There's an awful lot of them.
Like what masochists these early writers were. That like you have this idea, right, for the Canterbury Tales. You're like, I've got all these pilgrims, and they're all going to tell stories on their journey, right? But maybe they'll tell 2 stories on the way and on the way. Like, why are you making so much work for yourself, bro? Like,
well, because I think isn't the Canterbury Tales like an epic poem? So they each tell 2 stories.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely an epic poem.
And I forget, because those are 12 books total. There's 12 books per epic poem.
Yeah, he didn't even finish it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those things like the Fairy Queen. Another one that I read in my English major is like, okay, this didn't get finished, and that's the part I find I actually find that kind of amusing as a meta thing of like this guy, because the story of the guy writing the Fairy Queen is actually this tragic, kind of sad story, and I find that amusing because. Not because it's like funny that this guy died in exile because he never finished his book, but he thought this was actually going to work. That's the part I thought was funny. Like he's writing this so the queen would bring him back from exile.
Yeah, when I think about 1001 stories, Like, why did you decide that on that number, other than the fact that it's just like kind of like a nice round number, right? Like it's got a nice ring to it.
Right. Well, I think it's because it's 1,000 nights or whatever, and then there's the thousand the last story is the frame story, I believe.
Yeah.
I'm not, but I don't know why there's 1,000. Maybe it's just they had that many stories lying around and decided to write that many up. I don't know.
Right. And they thought these stories aren't strong enough by themselves, but
I'm also
if we can find a way to throw them all in there together.
right. Yeah. I don't know if there actually 1,000 in the book. I'm not sure.
Actually, I'm not sure. I haven't read.
I think there's a ton of them. There's a ton of them, but there's a lot. There's not. I don't know if there's 1,000. That'd be a lot of stories. I don't think. I have it on my Kindle, but I don't think it's like 10,000 pages
I think
long.
in a story like that, you always have like the ripcord, right? Like you always have sort of the out that you could just kill the storyteller, or like this person just doesn't make it, or the pilgrims decide they're tired and they don't want to make the trip, and or whatever. You just
Well, the other thing is that in the Arabian Nights thing, there's a lot of those are framed as well. They go deeper into more stories, so it might not be 1,000 titles by our standards.
Right,
but there's and so it's more metaphorical. There's it's this infinite well of story is kind of more the feel of it.
And that is it's so interesting that that's so early in the literary tradition, right? Because the framed thing and the levels, well, we really start to think about how those things start to fall apart in modernism and postmodernism, right? How the boundaries of stories start to break, and the lines between fiction and reality are blurred, right? But it's interesting that the frames had been there for so long, and it took so long for us to decide to break them. And it took something like global violence and catastrophe to make us decide that those boundaries were worth breaking, right?
That's interesting, yeah, because until like World War I, most stories had a frame. Almost everyone, like Frankenstein. You go back to Frankenstein. It's epistolary. It's letters. You have
epistolary was a huge tradition, right?
Yeah.
For I mean, that was a huge Victorian thing too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, most of those stories are not just like third person limited or whatever. There's some kind of device that says this is how you're getting the story, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, we talked a lot about these frames and stuff, but you wear many hats, so to speak. It's so beyond the so your contemporary fantasy. What do you have how many books do you have out in contemporary fantasy? I guess I'm just curious.
There are 2 novels, and then a sort of a collection that is a short story and a stage play adaptation of that story. And all of those stories, all 3 of those stories, the 2 novels and the play, are all they all exist in a same sort of extended universe.
Okay.
So they're not direct sequels. It's not a series necessarily, but there's a larger sort of narrative arc being told over the course of the stories, even though the most that they ever really do to each other is nod to each other.
Okay, so there's... Yeah, it's interesting because I've tried. I obviously, as an independent author, at least for me, and in the genres I write in, series is considered to be really important, and it is very helpful to have a series to help readers get to know you over a longer period of time than just one book.
Right.
And I have so much trouble writing series. That I'll just level with everybody right now. I have a hard time with that. Partially because I just have too many ideas for different weird worlds and characters and stuff. And I know I'm always wanting to switch to the next thing, and it happens usually about 30% and then 70% through the book. And every time it's like I just want to quit. I just want to go do the new book.
And I have such a I don't know. I have a real appreciation for stories that end.
Yes.
And don't just keep going. And obviously the world keeps going, right? But I think that the point of any story is to tell a story, right? A story that has a beginning and an end. Now, the world at large can continue operating at its own pace or whatever, but the goal of a novel, at least in my head, is to dip down into the life of a person long enough to explore this one narrative moment and then dip back out. And so I have very character-driven work for the most part. I do have 2 novels that are that are ready to go, that are like, one is ready to go, one's going to the publisher soon, and then the other one is in a first draft sort of stage. And those are the two books that are closest to being sequels to each other that I've ever written. And the protagonists still change over, but they're still like the main antagonist is kind of like the big bad of the world. This is my Avengers Endgame moment, right?
Okay.
Because I think I'm wrapping up this extended universe experience because I kind of want to go do something else after this. But I also understand what you mean about series and as a marketing tool and for readership and things like that. And so I branded this as the world of muses because I do borrow heavily from Greek mythology in the work, at least early on, and muses and things like that. And so I did brand it as kind of a loose series, right? But not serial, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. And actually, the series I've been working on is kind of a looser series as well, because each book is, I mean, the books actually follow basically the same characters, but the focus is different in each book, and they're very episodic. Like, okay, we finished this story. Now we're on to the next book, the next story. And I'm not sure how well it's working. It's epic fantasy, so people tend to expect a giant build. And maybe that's wrong for my writing style, honestly, because I'm not about the giant build. Like you said, I like stories that end. I like having at least bites that I can take and not feel like I have to read 10 books just to get the story, you know?
Yeah, I like it when a reader gets to the end of my book, they know that it's over. Like it may not feel great, right? The ending,
Might be sad, yeah.
Yeah, but you'll know that it's done. You know. I mean, at least I hope so.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, like the movie I just talked about. I just talked about recently that I really enjoyed watching for the first time was Alien 3, and like, oh, by the end of that movie, you know it's done. There's nobody left. Like, you can't. Who would this movie be about if it was supposed to keep going? And there's something really nice about that quality in any media, even when it is, terrifying or sad or whatever. What happens?
Yeah, but at the same time, our I guess this is a cultural thing. I wouldn't know necessarily, and I don't mean even like American culture. I mean just culture at large. Maybe it's just like contemporary culture. But I hate being at the theater. I'd love to be at the theater, but I hate when I got to go to the theater and at the end of the movie, it was so clearly over that people were like, I guess that means there's going to be a part 2. I'm like, no, bro, like it's just done, man. Like just let it go.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like,
There's
need for another, like a follow-up. I mean, I don't know. It feels a little, I'm about to catch some hate, but I'm coming in hot on your show here, Timmy. Sorry, I shouldn't.
That's okay. You can call me Timmy. That's fine. I get it. I get it all the time.
Him. And that is that it feels a little like a lazy consumer practice to want to just revisit the same things over and over and over again. Like we don't have maybe the energy or the patience to invest in new stories and new characters. So we have to regurgitate everything every time.
No, I actually agree with that a lot. I actually really like writing stories about different characters and different places and stuff. And even though my characters do end up being kind of similar, I like to be able to twist the stuff that I want to change, for the story. And I don't want to have to like literally write about the accreted experiences of one individual for 10 books, 12 books.
Right, I just spent 80,000 words with this guy, and he's kind of an asshole. Like,
yeah, well, and I actually find it worse though, and even when I write with multiple points of view, because I'm like, I have to love all these point of view characters the same amount, and it has to be high, like for at least 3 books if I'm going to write a series about them, like an epic fantasy thing,
Yeah,
and that's tough. It's a tough sell for me at this point, and I haven't done it for a while.
The epic fantasy thing is just something that I don't even I think that my brain just doesn't work in that way to and maybe this isn't what you do, like the invention of whole new worlds and languages.
No, that's what I do. That's what I do.
Like that's wild, man.
I invented a whole new type of universe when I was younger. It's hard to do that, but like, I mean, that's not for my epic fantasy. That's for my science fiction. But and I've told people kind of have heard about this one, but the Pillar universe it has different physics than our universe. So so instead it doesn't have planets, it doesn't have stars, it doesn't have any of those things. and yet people live there. That's the only thing it really has in common with us is some of the life
that's
forms.
dope, though. So when you start inventing something like that, this is like I have so much respect for people that can start from like sort of point A and like build an entire world out or an entire universe in this case, right?
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about that in your brain, is there like, okay, we're not going to have planets, but we're going to sub in this other thing for like,
yes,
people have to live somewhere.
pillars instead of planets, of planets as it was. And then I realized, and it took many years for this to happen because I actually came up with the pillar universe when I was a kid. And I finally wrote a book in it. And when I was writing the book, when I was in my 20s, I was thinking, and this is Origin of Storms, which is out now. But in this book, I'm like, okay, well, humans wouldn't evolve on a pillar in the pillar universe. That's a basic problem I'm having with this setting. Because pillars are pretty big, but they're like caves inside. They're vertical. You still fall. You can't walk on the side of them.
Right.
So where do humans evolve if they can't walk on the side of a pillar? They can't crawl around like a spider or any of that stuff. Well, they have to have a big flat area. That's the only place humans make any sense. The Serengeti Plain, basically. At least in the pillar universe, those are actually fairly rare. So I found this thing called a reef. Like this is how the process works. I'm like, I need this, or the rest won't make sense. That's how the whole pillar universe got to work. I mean, I was like, but the seed was all in like Star Wars. But then I was an 8-year-old or something, and I'm like, what's weird? What's wrong with Star Wars? Well, every sci-fi has planets and stars in it. Was basically what I thought back then. At least that's what I remember. And that's a ridiculous kid thing to think. And then I'm like, but it's the kind of thing I think more authors would benefit from doing. Yeah. I mean, not to say the pillar universe you need to go that extreme, but thinking like a kid is really useful sometimes.
I think that is absolutely true. I mean, we have all of these sort of arbitrary self-imposed rules at this point, right? And especially you and I, who went through like formal English literature education. I think that as much as I said earlier that we value from reading those things, I think that we also do have to do work after that education to kind of break the chains of academia. And to like sort of that knowledge is so valuable and useful, but academia puts such restriction on you that it does take some time to sort of work your way back into that creative ether,
Exactly. It took me many years, actually, so at least 5 or 6 years after I graduated from college to be able to really write books again that I liked. It took a while. I finally did it. I mean, it wasn't 5 or 6 years, but it was like 3 or 4 that I could basically not finish anything. I'd write half a book. I'm like, is this good enough? Yeah, and there'd be settings I loved. There'd be stories that I was really enjoying, and I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I like this, and I was just asking too many questions about it. Yeah.
I think so much of that is that academia teaches. I think the strongest lesson of academia is paranoia, or anxiety, right? That your work isn't good enough.
Yeah, and it's so sad, actually. Yeah, that's a huge problem.
It's an imposter syndrome almost, right?
Yeah. And honestly, without that, I'd have been publishing sooner. I mean, I would have started my indie career maybe in 2014. I could have, or 2010 even.
There's something in
2013. Yeah,
very hesitant to pursue alternative means of publication.
Yes.
Because in academia, everything is peer reviewed. Everything has to go through the gatekeepers. Everything has to, and that is just kind of drilled into us. And while in an academic setting, that stuff has its value, and I think that in the world at large, in the scientific community, peer review is very important. It is, I think, kind of detrimental to the budding artist to have all of those arbitrary restrictions kind of taught at them to the point that they're ingrained in our decision making.
I couldn't agree more. When you're an artist, you have to be free. It's like, I forget who said it, but you have to write like you're an orphan. I think that was Oscar Wilde. You've got to, or it was some Victorian, I think, era writer said like, yeah, you have to write as if you were an orphan. You must pretend no one cares, no one knows you, basically. Yeah. And then you can be free. And it also reminds me of that Fight Club quote. It's only when we've lost everything are we free to do anything. It's like that, because. Yeah. But in a metaphorical sense, in the case of the writers, you don't have to burn your house down or whatever to become a writer. No, what you need to do is, and you don't need to do this. Actually, this is the kind of thing you should not listen to. You shouldn't listen to people who tell you you need to do stuff. What you should do is just do what you want to do, and that's the hardest part, though. We live in quite a repressed world. I mean, we've got more freedom now in a lot of ways than we ever have, but the mind is never free, and that's my pulpit I'll preach from.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying. The mind is never free. The freest it ever is when we're children.
Yes, and the more freedom you can claw back from the world, I think the better off you'll be as a writer. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's more creative, the easier it will be. So Shane, we are running a little bit. We're actually way out of time, but I want to ask you, because now that I know a little bit more about you, and I know you are, you've got this background in literature and stuff. But have you been reading anything lately? Anything you want to talk about?
So I have. Speaking of sci-fi, I've just started The High Republic, the new Star Wars novel, but I haven't gotten too far into it, so I don't want to say too much about that yet. But I'll say I've been consuming a lot of. I've actually been consuming some nonfiction.
Okay.
I've been working my way through Bruce Springsteen's memoir, Born to Run. Speaking of someone who's in the news lately, but because I'm putting out my first album soon, so I've been consuming like musician autobiography and stuff like that.
Beautiful. Yeah. So as for me, I mean, I've not been reading as much as I should have, as usual. But I will say I do have a recommendation for people, and I'm probably late to the boat on this, and it's gonna be silly but as far as storytelling goes, I can't recommend some certain anime enough, actually. And I've really been struck by the beginning of this one show I've been watching. So the first 5 or 6 episodes of Demon Slayer, pretty good, very beautiful, well drawn. But anyway, that's the nerd side here showing, of course.
Yeah.
But this show's all about the nerd side, so there's no problem there.
Anime is something that I have always been told that I would enjoy, and it feels, because it's such a foreign world to me that I've never consumed any anime, I don't even really know where to start with that stuff. So I always ask you.
Okay, so where should you start with anime? Well, that could take a while. I actually think I think that there's a couple really classic series that are good to start with. Because when I started, I was a teenager when I started watching anime, and I wouldn't start with Neon Genesis Evangelion. That's more of an advanced level thing. You need to watch a couple other shows to get, especially because until you realize that this medium can basically be anything, it is more of a medium than it is a genre.
Right.
You're not going to necessarily want to see a show that's that crazy and weird. I would say it depending on your style, because there are anime that are basically mainstream young adult. There are anime that are science fiction. It depends on your genre. Right now, the biggest one is this isekai genre, but I'm not a huge fan of that. Isekai being lit RPG or pulled into another world stories. Not my favorite thing in the world that's so popular right now. But
we should start a companion podcast called Tim Teaches Shane Anime.
I'd love to do that, but I'm so busy with podcasts and books right now.
I know.
That would be great. But anyway, the one I was gonna say, I've waffled enough, but I wanted to say the place I would start is actually the 2003 Full Metal Alchemist anime. And that's a little tricky, because that anime. There's a newer anime the newer anime is also reasonable to start with. The Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. They're both on Netflix, so you can just have your choice there if you have Netflix.
Yeah, I've heard that Full Metal Alchemist is the place to start.
2003 was my first anime, and it was a good one. Let me say. I mean, it's one of those ones that the ending might be a little disappointing. And then when you realize it was because they ran out of manga, they ran out of comics to adapt from, because the comics were running coterminously. That's why the end
story of television adaptations, though.
Yes, except for that. That's why Brotherhood is. A lot of people recommend Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood instead. This is a controversial subject for a lot of anime fans, because Brotherhood adapted the manga completely after the manga was already out, and it was the same studio made both shows. So it's a very interesting comparison here. But both, and it had a bigger budget because the first show was already a huge success. So
gotcha.
Yeah. Anyway, but most of the first show is actually better. Minute by minute is a better show than Brotherhood. The stuff that's there, which is very weird. It's a weird dichotomy. It's like, so do you like a better beginning or a better ending? Is really the question with those two shows. But they're both pretty good.
Do you suggest watching the original up to a point and then switching over?
Well, you'd have to watch No, it won't work because they actually changed some of the rules of like how some of the stuff works. Being that it is a semi-fantasy setting, like it is a fantasy, and so like they changed like okay the nature of certain things. They don't adapt directly into each other at any point.
Yeah.
But if you watch the first one, you probably would enjoy the second one as well. That's the funny part. But then you're watching 150 episodes of shows to get one story.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't know. I did it. Not a bad choice.
Yeah. I'll give it a go.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Shane, tell people where they can find your work.
Well, the easiest place to find all things Shane Wilson is at ShaneWilsonAuthor.com. I'm also on all the socials at that Shane Wilson. That's the best way to do it, man.
Nice. Thanks for being on the show, Shane. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Would do again. Would have you on again. So as for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. And you can find my books at timniederreiter.com, or if you feel like spelling my name phonetically in English words, you can find me at timniederreiter.com. Need, N-E-E-D, W-R-I-T-E-R.com. Because that's easier to spell than my crazy German mangled last name. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody, and talk to you next week. Or actually, I guess midweek at this point. Talk to you on Wednesday. Bye.
That tears it.